The time's 10 o'clock and you are tuned to WERU-FM, 89.9 Blue Hill, 99.9 Bangor, and streaming online everywhere at weru.org. The debut of a brand new show, Coastal Conversations, with your host Natalie Springle, is up next.
Good morning, and welcome to Coastal Conversations, a new show here on WERU. We explore issues facing Maine's coastal communities through dialogue with people who live, work, and play on our coast. From fisheries to tourism, from energy to environment, from economy to ecology, we go up beyond the social media soundbites, probing deeply into complex issues and solutions. Coastal Conversations is produced with help from the University of Maine Sea Grant Program, whose mission is to support Maine's coastal communities through research, outreach, and education. In partnership with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the University of Maine Cooperative Extension, Maine Sea Grant brings marine science to Maine people. We're about to engage in the heart and soul of community radio, in which those of us in the studio and you who are listening create a dialogue that we hope will be of benefit to our coast and our communities. This is Natalie Springle, and I hope you will stay with us for the next hour of Coastal Conversations. This morning, our topic is ocean acidification, when the chemistry of the ocean changes and how that affects the organisms that live in the ocean and the humans who rely on it to make a living. We are joined today by a bunch of folks who know a whole lot about ocean acidification. We'll have on the line Joe Salisbury, who's a research professor of oceanography and biogeochemistry at the University of New Hampshire. We'll also talk with Bill Mook, who's the owner of Mook Sea Farms out of Walpole. And in the studio, we'll talk with Damian Brady, who's an assistant professor at the School for Marine Sciences at the Darling Marine Center and the assistant director of research at the University of Maine Sea Grant. And finally, we'll also talk with Esperanza Stancioff, who's a climate change educator for the University of Maine Cooperative Extension and Sea Grant. So I think we have Joe Salisbury on the line. Joe, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, you're entirely welcome. And hello, Damian and Esperanza.
Hi, Joe.
Hey, Joe.
Great. It's great to have all of you guys. I know that you guys all know each other because you've been doing a whole lot of research and outreach together on this topic. So we're excited to have all of you. Joe, we wanted to start with you because we were hoping that you could start with the basics. I think a lot of folks who are listening to us today, this might be the first time they're hearing about ocean acidification. Maybe not. I know it's been in the news more lately with, for example, a Portland Press Herald article, I think just yesterday. But tell us the basics. What is ocean acidification in simple terms?
So ocean acidification is the lowering of pH of the surface ocean, and that will propagate throughout the ocean over time. And the primary mechanism for this is the dissolution of carbon dioxide coming from the atmosphere into the surface ocean. The surface ocean is will dissolve a tremendous amount of carbon dioxide. It's easily dissolved, and when the pressure, what we call the partial pressure of the atmosphere, gets higher in carbon dioxide than partial pressure of the surface ocean, then that will dissolve. That will kind of scoot into the ocean, and it will go through a process of what we call dissociation, and in effect lowering the pH. And that's it. That's basically it in a nutshell. And so the other thing that's important to say is that our carbon dioxide levels of the atmosphere are increasing, and they're increasing rapidly, and they're increasing more rapidly as time goes on. And of course, I think most of your audience would know that the excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is largely attributable to human activities.
And you mentioned that it lowers the pH of the ocean. And for those of us who haven't taken chemistry since maybe the 10th grade, can you remind us what pH measures?
So pH is a measure of the hydrogen ion concentration, basically, and hydrogen ions are associated with acidity, and so this is, the more hydrogen ions you have in a solution, the more acidic it is, and so acid, of course, most folks know the concept of acid. It will react with what we call bases and neutralize. And one of the things that it reacts with is calcium carbonate, the material that we have in our bones. And many of the organisms in the ocean, especially the commercial organisms, are shelled organisms. We're talking about the clams and the oysters, and Bill's here. He's going to talk about these. But also lobsters in their shells. A small part of their shell is this calcium carbonate, and lowering the pH makes it more difficult for these organisms to fix this calcium carbonate.
Why is that?
Why is that? Well, it's lowering, dropping the pH will. So I don't know how technical we want to get here, but lowering the pH will basically drop the concentrations of what we call the carbonate ion, and I use the word calcium carbonate, and so we need to have both of those to fix this shell type material. And if you are dropping the carbonate ion, that it makes an organism either, one, work harder to fix this calcium carbonate, or it might make it so that if it gets low enough, this organism will start to dissolve away.
Okay. And how about other organisms in the ocean? Phytoplankton, finfish, whales?
Right. So there's been a lot of research lately, but the conclusions of this research are just coming out now. So you mentioned phytoplankton. So plants in the ocean, these may actually benefit from increased carbon dioxide levels in the ocean. The jury's out on this, but you can imagine if you consider this a nutrient for the plants, they take this up, then they could perhaps prosper. Maybe not. The jury's out on that. As far as fish are concerned, there are other stresses besides stresses to the shell. There are, reproductive stresses that a low pH environment may encourage. There are also things like olfactory stresses. The sense of smell will differ according to the pH gradient. That's kind of interesting, but there's been a considerable amount of work done on that. As far as whales are concerned, believe it or not, the sound speed changes quite a bit with what we call the borate chemistry, and this is a function of acidity in the water. So the sound speed changes, and so whale communications may be interfered with as time goes on. Again, I don't want to pull an alarm on any of this material, but these are things that we are currently considering.
Wow, that's fascinating. Tell us a little bit about your research.
My research, so I study productivity in the ocean and coastal chemical cycling in the ocean. And with colleagues at the University of New Hampshire, I live in Maine, but I work at the University of New Hampshire. We have several observation sites, and a few of them have carbon dioxide. And so what we've been able to document is the seasonality of carbon dioxide and pH in the surface ocean. We're trying to understand what causes that variability in the carbon dioxide. So we do see a trend. We've been measuring this for about 10 years, and we see a lowering of pH and an increase of carbon dioxide here in the Gulf of Maine. But this is a little bit less than what we have been measuring in the atmosphere, so we don't really understand why that is. We are also trying to kind of pick apart these seasonal cycles and figure out what processes are contributing to parts of the seasonal cycle. So we have a biological component. We have a big phytoplankton bloom in the springtime. We have this freshwater runoff, which is another subject that maybe we'll get to later in the show, which is part of this coastal acidification process. We have a process called upwelling, where deeper water will come up to the surface, and we also have this horizontal mixing of this circulation throughout the Gulf of Maine. And all these things change the acidity, and all these contribute to a seasonal cycle. So we need to understand these processes before we can say that atmospheric carbon dioxide is changing the acidity of the ocean here. I mean, we suspect that it is, but what I'm saying is there's so many other factors that we also need to understand in a complex coastal zone.
It sounds unbelievably complex, and you must be working with a huge diversity of different researchers to look at all the different parameters that you're looking at.
Yeah, we have great ones. I'm sitting here at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. I want to make sure to give them a plug. And
Great.
They let us use the phone today. There's good researchers here. The University of Maine, Damian's crew is starting up some great research. Larry Mayer is there at the Darling Center, and he's done some fantastic work. And then, a lot of the science is starting to be done by folks like Bill Mook and Mark Green, who are actually in the business, but are also able to take measurements for us and monitor both the chemistry and the biology.
Well, that sounds like a perfect opportunity to hear from Bill. Bill, are you there?
Yeah, he's here.
Great. So Bill Mook is the owner of Mook Sea Farms, which is a shellfish farm, down in the Damariscotta area. Bill, tell us a little bit about your farm before we jump into the role that you've played in teasing out the complexities of ocean acidification.
Sure.
And hello, and thanks for joining us, by the way.
Hello, and thanks for having me on and giving me this chance to talk about this. We've been in business for 30 years on the Damariscotta River. We're an oyster farm. We raise oysters from fertilized egg to market size. We sell little baby oysters called seed, and we also grow oysters all the way to full size and sell them for the half-shell market. And essentially, what we've discovered is that hatcheries kind of are the canaries in the coal mine when it comes to ocean acidification.
Huh. In what way?
Well, it turns out that one of the things that we do a lot of in the hatcheries, we rear the oysters through all the very early life stages, and it turns out that larvae are really the most vulnerable form of or life stage of the oyster, because the larval shell is made out of a form of calcium carbonate called aragonite, which is much more soluble than the form of the shell that they make as an adult, which is called calcite. So,
and by soluble, you mean more easily dissolved in water?
Correct. Okay. Exactly. And that, of course, makes the larvae the most vulnerable, to ocean acidification or coastal acidification. And I could also explain that, the larval, what happens is you fertilize the oyster eggs, and those eggs develop within 24 hours or so into a very tiny swimming larva that stays swimming in the water for about 14 to 16 days. And essentially what we began seeing probably sometime after 2006 or so, we began to notice more and more times when we would fertilize the eggs that those eggs would not convert to these larvae. We would just lose them. And that didn't happen all that often, but more often the other thing we saw was that the larvae during this 14 to 16-day larval period would all of a sudden just slow way down in their growth, stop feeding, and the growth would stop. And sometimes it would take us up to a week longer or even more to get those larvae to go through the metamorphosis where they become a juvenile oyster.
And you had not seen this kind of change in their cycle before?
We not. I wouldn't say we'd never seen it, but certainly not at the frequency we started to see it. And I think the other notable thing to say about that was that we were really able to link these events to large runoff events after big rainstorms.
Okay.
And that's sort of how we got worried about acidification, because the fresh water has a lower pH.
So help us understand. So the fresh water comes in.
Fresh water is more acidic than seawater. Seawater,
Okay.
One thing Joe didn't mention is that the pH scale is a little bit counterintuitive because the lower the number, the higher the acidity. And so where open ocean seawater has a pH that's usually a little over 8, rainwater and runoff has a much lower pH. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but it's probably more like maybe, Joe, 5 or so. So essentially, you're bringing more hydrogen ions in when you get these big rain events and increased runoff.
Okay, I see. So how did you start figuring out what was happening in your hatchery?
Well, we got tipped off, actually. It turns out, and I don't know if your viewer or your listeners are aware of this, but the oyster industry in the Pacific Northwest almost collapsed back starting around 2007, 8, and 9. And it turns out in 2009, several growers made a trip to Maine and spoke with a number of us in the oyster business, shellfish business, and described what they had finally figured out, which was that they were pumping more acidic water into their hatcheries. And it was a different reason for them doing that, but essentially when they described the symptoms, lights started to go off for us, and that's what kind of started us on the hunt in earnest for trying to figure out whether or not we were having calcium or carbonate problems in the hatchery.
Now, I know that ocean acidification has become a significant enough issue in marine circles that there's a commission, an Ocean Acidification Commission that has been formed and has recently put out a report, I think. And I believe maybe you both are on it. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I
can. The commission was formed a little less than a year ago, and it was formed by the Maine legislature to study existing and potential impacts on commercially important species in Maine. They wanted us to identify monitoring and research that is needed to be able to understand acidification processes better, and essentially come up with mitigation steps, identify ways that we can sort of lessen the impact, and then also try to figure out how best to increase public awareness of acidification. The commission was made up of representatives from the legislature, from the research community, from industry, various state departments were represented. And what we did to start with was we formed 2 subcommittees, one which looked at the report that the state of Washington generated as part of they formed a commission before we did, and they had issued their report. So we decided that rather than reinvent the wheel, we would look at what they did, look at the science review they did, and try to see if any of their work could be useful for us, which it was. And then the second subcommittee was essentially a committee that would review the existing state of the science and come up with a report for that. And that report actually is included in the full commission report as an appendix, and there's an executive summary of that in there as well. And then, if you want, I can kind of give you a rundown on the goals and recommendations. Would you like that?
Yeah, that would be great. And also if it's available, if it's something that members of the public can take a look at.
It is. It actually was just formally released yesterday. I believe.
Great.
Is that right, Joe? And they were waiting to get certain copyright permissions for the state of the science part of it, but that has been obtained, and it was released yesterday. And there's a link which Joe, I think he's on his computer right now. Maybe he can email you that link for people that you could put on your website so people can go look that report up.
Okay.
But basically there were 6 goals identified, each of which had a bunch of recommendations, and they ranged, starting with essentially increasing Maine's capacity to monitor and investigate impacts of coastal and ocean acidification on commercial species. The second goal was to reduce CO2 emissions, and that involved trying to strengthen and add to there were a bunch of existing efforts to reduce emissions in Maine. We wanted to increase those and also identify new ways, perhaps, encourage economic development of new technologies that would provide economic benefit to Maine. The third goal was to reduce nutrient and freshwater runoff that may be contributing to the problem in coastal areas. Then the fourth goal was to mitigate, remediate, and adapt, and that involved a range of things from preserving and managing microalgal areas, with macroalgae rather, which takes up carbon dioxide and therefore helps reduce ocean acidification. And also use of shells, for example, to buffer mudflats, things like that. The fifth was involved recommending that we set a goal to inform and educate the public and decision makers about ocean acidification. And then finally, it was felt that we really needed to have a sustained effort in the state, and there was a recommendation to form an ocean acidification council that would see this process into the future.
Great. I think that we're taking care of your next to last, or beginning to take care of that recommendation to inform the public about the issues. So that's great.
I think so. This is great.
Before we let you guys go, I wonder, Bill, if you could just give us a sense of what the prognosis for the future is for your industry in light of what you've been discovering about ocean acidification.
That, in fact, is the big question. And I think one of the things that we realized that through our activities on the Commission was that we really don't know the answer to that. We need to do a lot of research and monitoring to start to piece that together. And I think the question is this if you want to use a human illness as a metaphor or analogy, is this a chronic illness that we're going to just be trying to manage as we go forward, for the rest of our lives, or is it a terminal illness that's going to wipe us out quickly? And I just don't think we know the answer to that. There are a lot of parts to that, in terms of how we go about trying to figure it out, and I think some of what Damian may be talking about later will speak to that in terms of the modeling. We need to understand more. We're in a part of the country where freshwater runoff and rainfall precipitation amounts are increasing with time, and it's a rather dramatic increase. It's been a 76% increase or 74% increase in heavy precipitation events over the last 50 years in New England. And so we need to know what the future modeling for that is, and then start modeling coastal areas to figure out what actually is going to be going on with the carbonate chemistry. And then on top of that, which is a complex enough problem, you have to try to figure out how all these things are going to affect very complex ecosystems. So we just don't know the answer for the prognosis question.
Okay, a lot of unknowns. It sounds like it's really in the beginning stages of research. So. Very
much so.
Great. Well, thank you.
It really is a new area of scientific inquiry. The first impact papers on organisms are only barely 10 years old.
Yeah, that's very new. Okay, well, thanks. We will we'll let you guys go, and we'll continue the conversation here. Thank you so much to Joe Salisbury, a research professor of oceanography and biogeochemistry at the University of New Hampshire. And also thanks to Bill Mook from Mook Sea Farms for helping us understand the basics of ocean acidification.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to remind listeners that you're listening to a brand new show on WERU. This is Coastal Conversations, airing each fourth Friday of the month at 10 to 11 a.m. In the studio today, we're talking about ocean acidification. And we are going to hear now from Damian Brady, who is the assistant professor who is an assistant professor at the School for Marine Sciences at the University of Maine's Darling Marine Center, and also the assistant director of research at the University of Maine Sea Grant. And we also have Esperanza Stancioff, who's a climate change educator with the University of Maine Cooperative Extension and Sea Grant. We just heard a lot about the science of ocean acidification, and so let's go there a little bit more. Damian, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Natalie.
Damian, tell us a little bit about what you do. What is your research area?
Yeah, so as Bill referred to a little bit, I'm interested in modeling. So these are sort of numerical models of how estuaries and coastal zones work. You can sort of think of them as virtual labs where we can explore, a multitude of things that are changing. I think that Bill and Joe referred to, because you have changing temperatures, changing precipitation, how much rain and runoff are coming into these areas. And then, of course, you've got changes in the land use in Maine that are all occurring sort of simultaneously and over time. So we use these sort of virtual models of how these systems work to try to figure out how they're going to change in the future.
Great. Thank you. And Esperanza, welcome to the program. Tell us a little bit about your work. What is a climate change educator?
Thank you, Natalie. I'm engaged in a lot of different projects, ocean acidification, outreach, education, and research being one of them. So I primarily work in communities with different ways that they might need support, and working together with researchers and bringing them into communities as well to try to determine solutions for climate change adaptation.
Great. I wanted to ask you, Esperanza, something that I think it was Bill referred to. He said, if I got it right, he said that something like 74%, there's been a 74% increase in storms in the last 50 years, if I got that right. Tell us a little bit about those kinds of numbers, not necessarily the specific statistics, but what that means and why does it impact, why does the fresh water coming out of the sky impact the ocean?
Right. Well, there's a lot of different ways that impacts marine resources, just to talk about that, and how it increases ocean acidification and increased nutrient loading from a lot more freshwater runoff. So the nutrients like from septic system failures and perhaps illicit connections and, any type of nutrients from our pollutants basically that come with that extreme rain events that are happening more and more. And those will cause the increase, for example, in algal blooms, which then with die-off create a hypoxic condition or less oxygen. But also, which is less known, is the consequences of that can also be a lowered pH and the production of carbon dioxide increased, basically, and then lowering of pH.
So we're seeing more storms, we're seeing more rainfall events, and that is, in the end, contributing to increased acidification.
Yes, and lowered salinity. There's all the different types of combinations of effects that will create problems for organisms. I mean, primary productivity is also another issue, which researchers at Bigelow are working on, Barney Balch primarily, and Meredith White. And so those are other factors that come into it that create issues for marine organisms and for unhealthy conditions.
So many factors. The ocean is just an incredibly complex environment. So that's where you come in, Damian, because you are the modeler. You try to incorporate the factors. Or before we go there, what were you going to say?
The ocean is a very, very complex place. I don't think anyone would deny that. But one of the ways we can think of this is the sources of acidity can broadly in our coastal zone come from sort of three different sources. So they can be internally produced by respiration, so breathing in, breathing out causes CO2 to come into the water in the same way that higher CO2 in the air getting into the water causes acidity. So that can happen internally in the system. So the algal material that gets respired by the system causes more CO2, so the whole ecosystem is breathing. So that's sort of naturally produced CO2 that's in the system internally being produced. Then there's a source of acidity from this fresh water that we talked about. And then there's, in our coastal zone, there's a source of acidity from the ocean. So you can sort of think of these three sources. This freshwater side bringing in more acidic water because, as Joe said on the phone there, the runoff can be as low as 5 on the pH scale. And if you think of 7 as being neutral from your high school chemistry days, then you're throwing 5 pH water into the system, so that's lowering the pH of the coastal zone. Then you have the ocean water, which used to be a source of high pH water that is lowering in pH over time. And then you have the internal dynamics and how the system works and how it breathes. So if we think of those three sources, what we try to do on the modeling side and what we try to do in terms of understanding when and where low pH is going to be a problem, we try to balance these three sources and disentangle what's really causing the acidity in the coastal zone.
What are some other arenas where you've had interesting results using models like this?
Yeah, so I think that one of the themes we've heard today so far is that this is very new, at least relatively so. But there are models that we can look to. It's a little bit like climate change when we think about, how do we solve large global climate change issues? A lot of people will point to ozone. For instance, and our ability to fix, which I'm using air quotes right now here, but fix the ozone layer problem. There are models that are similar to coastal acidification or ocean acidification. So one of them is one that Esperanza just brought on, spoke about, which is nutrients that come from the land into the water. They cause something called eutrophication, which is just too many nutrients in the water. So it's just like over-fertilizing your lawn, for instance. It causes a lot of plant material to sink, and then it causes what's known in the public as dead zones. So there's very famous dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico and the Chesapeake Bay. This is where the bottom layer of a lot of these coastal zones are bereft of oxygen, so they're hypoxic or anoxic. And so what we've done in the past is we've used models to figure out what the nutrient load, so how many nutrients are coming in from the land, how they grow algae, sink, and cause these dead zones. And then we use those models to inform how much we need to decrease nutrients in order to solve the problem. So that's the maybe one of the best models for how we might start to think about managing coastal acidification in the future.
Okay, great. I just wanted to let listeners know that you're listening to Coastal Conversations on WERU Community Radio. Our topic today for our first show in this new program is ocean acidification. And in the studio with me today, I have Damian Brady from the University of Maine and Esperanza Stancioff, also from the University of Maine. And we are going to open it up for your calls. If you have any questions, comments, concerns for these guys in the studio related to ocean acidification, the chemistry of the ocean, and how our actions may or may not impact it, anything at all, feel free to give us a call at 1-866-625-9378, 1-866-625-WERU. Esperanza, tell us a little bit about what's already been happening in terms of citizens and businesses and stakeholders and decision makers becoming involved in this conversation.
Well, I would like to focus on one group, but
Sure.
I'd also like to point out that there are a lot of partners in Maine, and Maine is essentially the first East Coast state that really started thinking about this and having a lot of different forums and conferences and meetings about this. And I have to need to bring in our partners, Island Institute, as being really key also.
And just so listeners know, we did invite somebody from the Island Institute to join us on the call today, but they were not available, unfortunately.
So that's been happening. And alongside that, for the past year, we have developed a network called the Northeast Coastal Acidification Network. This is a group of, you heard from 2 of the steering committee members, and we have 10 from around the region of NECAN.
So NECAN is Northeast Coastal Acidification Network.
Correct. And our region goes from Long Island Sound all the way to Canada. So we're focused on the different subregions, and the Gulf of Maine being one of those. And so NECAN is implementing a multi-step process to synthesize regional ocean acidification science, communicate it to regional stakeholders, and solicit user input to the design of a Northeast Coastal Acidification Network. So really understanding the science of coastal and ocean acidification, engaging stakeholders in that process, and then coming up with a a state of the science synthesis, translating that, having that stakeholder input through workshops throughout the region. We plan to have 5 of those, and then come up with an implementation plan with working groups of citizens and stakeholders that can then help us with that. So that's it in a nutshell, and I can talk more about that.
Great. Let's hold off on that and take a call. I think we have David in Brooklyn on the line. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for the show. It, I think, promises to be really an important show for me and my listening pattern.
Thank you.
I'm glad you're putting it on.
Great.
I've been listening to the acidification discussion, and quite a while ago, I moved up here from the upper watershed of the Chesapeake Bay. And even at the time when I moved, we were aware that one of the major sources of pollution was the agribusiness farming that was going on, even so far away as Pennsylvania. We were growing a lot of corn around where I was living, and it would be monocropped year after year after year, and produced by a heavy application of nitrogen fertilizer, and a lot of that ended up in the bay, of course. And I wonder how much a part of the research that's going on up here might also have to do with farming methods. I'm a small-scale biodynamic farmer in intention, at least, and I see that small-scale farming, which makes heavy use of composting technique, can really offset the nitrate leaching which happens from the earth, which is a good thing for farming and also for the health of the ocean. So just was curious about the relation between the shore and the land and that.
David, really good question. I think that so what happens in terms of nutrient runoff from farms, but also from urban and suburban areas, is a lot of that, for the most part in the coastal zone, a lot of the productivity is limited by nitrogen. So nitrogen comes off the shores and into our waters, and that is fertilizer in the water just like it's fertilizer on land. And so generally in the Chesapeake Bay, for instance, if that algal material sinks to the bottom of the Chesapeake Bay, you get more respiration of that material because it's in the dark, then you have photosynthesis. So if we think back again on our high school biology, the photosynthesizers are creating oxygen, and when we get respiration, we're creating carbon dioxide, which will decrease the acidity. So any time where you essentially uncouple respiration from photosynthesis in the coastal zone, we can create more essentially acidity in that area. You can sort of think of it that way. And when it comes to Maine, of course, we don't have nearly the nitrogen load, for instance, that the Chesapeake Bay watershed might have. And we also have, in this state, versus other places, we have a macrotide, which allows for a lot of mixing to occur. So we don't have what we call like a two-layer water system in most estuaries where it sort of sinks and causes a lot of problems. That having been said, I think there's a role for all sorts of land uses to think about how they might be affecting the downstream watersheds. Agriculture has a role, but definitely combined sewer overflows in Portland to suburban, your lawn, for instance. So I think that there is a role for everyone, but we wouldn't pin acidification, for instance, in Maine on those types of issues, in particular.
Yeah, I would agree. I think also that agriculture in Maine is not that big along the coast as it used to be at one time. I also think that septic systems are a much bigger problem than almost anything else with nutrient loading. We don't have scheduled maintenance required in this state for for maintenance of septic systems. It's been a problem, and in the 20 years that I worked on water quality issues and we were actually looking for those pollution sources, it was almost always a failing septic system or an illicit pipe somewhere. So, of course, those days are gone for me, but that's what we were finding at that time.
David, does that help sort of address what you were wondering about? I think it must. Thank you, David. That was a great question, and it hits right on sort of some of the bigger questions that I've had about this issue, which is what can we do about it? What can we do about it?
Well, I certainly believe that education and awareness is the first step, and that's a lot of what many of the groups are trying to do here in Maine, as well as our NECAN, or our Northeast Coastal Acidification Network. So bringing people to the table, having these discussions, learning about what the sensitive areas are, where we should be providing more monitoring and research, what kinds of products we need to develop that can create better awareness and education, and those types of things. I can go on later about that.
Great, thanks. I think we have another caller. I think we have Sid from Appleton on the line, and I think this might be my old friend Sid. Hi, Sid.
Hi, Natalie. Thanks for doing this show. It's great.
Great. Glad to have you on the line. We'll have to catch up soon someday, but right now...
I have a question.
Great.
About the precipitation. I don't think that you guys mean that the actual total precipitation is up by 73%. I think what you mean is the extreme storm events. So could somebody explain that, and then explain how it is that is affecting the ocean, the near coastal area, differently than what was here before?
Great. Thanks for the clarification, Sid. Damian, what do we actually mean?
So that's a number that Bill quoted. It comes from the National Weather Service, and I believe that the real statistic is 73%, and Sid's correct. It's a 73% increase in the top 1% of storms. So we can think of it as the 5-year storm is now the 2.5-year storm, so we have an increase in the number of deluges, for instance, and so there's a multitude of things that can happen when you have an increase in extreme events, and I wouldn't dare say that we know exactly how that has changed things within our estuaries over that time. But for instance, those deluges can dislodge a lot more particulates and stuff from the land and put it into the water, and it can also have a larger effect on salinity. These sort of plug freshwater flows into our estuaries that that can overwhelm dams. They overwhelm combined sewer overflows quicker. If it's a slow rainfall, for instance, or it's drawn out over time, then a lot of our treatment plants can take care of a lot of that stuff. So there's a multitude of things that happen, but Sid's right. We don't want to give the impression that there's been a 73% increase in precipitation, but a 73% increase in the top 1% of storms over the last century is, I believe, what the real statistic is from the National Weather Service.
Great. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sid. I'm glad we caught that. That's a good clarification. The other day I was telling a few friends about this upcoming show, and they asked me some great questions that I'm going to put to you guys, because I think that they're, for folks who know nothing about ocean acidification, I was asked, does that mean the water is we have to be concerned about swimming? And these kinds of sort of really kind of public health kinds of concerns. Is that where we're heading with acidification? Help us get rid of the myths.
Well, I think as far as swimming in the ocean, we already have the issues upon us with the nutrients coming in and bacterial pollution from dog waste and septic system malfunction and all the things that we've been talking about that are already here as a problem. I would defer to Damian to talk about the ocean acidification issue. I think that the things that are causing coastal acidification are the things that the different components that we should be worried about as far as public health goes. As far as ocean acidification, I don't know. It would take I don't know the answer to that specifically.
Yeah, I don't think that on any level anyone should be afraid to go swimming, for instance. I mean, so, the way I like to think of this is, I believe that Bill quoted that the typical ocean pH is around 8, a little bit above 8. Even worst case climate projections, maybe it gets down to because the pH scale is also a logarithmic scale, so it's huge changes in the ocean chemistry for small changes in that unit that you hear. So 8, down to 7.9 is a really big change in the ocean chemistry. So I don't think we'll ever be getting to pHs that you might be concerned about, swimming in, for instance. So I don't think it's a public health issue by itself. No.
Right, not by itself. The issue is that some of the drivers of acidification are the similar issues that we need to pay attention to in terms of water quality. Thanks for that clarification. I think we have another caller. I think we have Brady, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, in Camden.
That's right. I probably mentioned this before, and it sounds quite frivolous, but as far as the storms that are washing things out and being expensive for municipalities and affecting freshwater quality, and I don't know if this would affect the saltwater and acidification, but my frivolous suggestion is beavers, that they slow down the water just as forests do, and we really need to think about land management that way and think about beaver management. And this is happening out west where they need the water more, and I don't know whether we take it into account, but they do make places where the water slows down.
That's an interesting idea. So using beavers to help manage the water flow.
Yeah.
Damian, what do you think?
No, that's not a frivolous statement at all, I don't think. For instance, a couple of times the Chesapeake Bay is brought up, and there are a lot of really interesting studies that show the sort of loss of beaver population coinciding with the beginning of water quality loss. And it's not necessarily about beavers by themselves. I think it's, and Brady remarks on it correctly, it's about slowing water down in the watershed, for instance, and allowing the sort of natural watershed processes, the biggest one being something called denitrification. And if you sort of break that word down, it just means getting rid of nitrogen and allowing the land to get rid of nitrogen before it reaches the water. But it's the same with salt marshes. It's the same with wastewater treatment plants, even dams. They all have a role in sort of processing the water before it reaches the coastal zone. So it's part of a broader strategy in a lot of places to think about slowing the water system down before it reaches the coastal zone.
Interesting. Thank you, Brady. That's a great question. Sometimes the frivolous and outlandish ideas are where we might find solutions. Thanks for your call. I have another question for you guys that's in the category of folks asked me a couple days ago that I just didn't know how to answer. So if cold water is more acidic, then is warming water a good thing for ocean acidification with water temperatures warming because of climate change?
So it's I was discussing this issue with a colleague of mine, Larry Mayer, who's on that OA commission, and it sort of depends on why the water's warming. If the water's warming because there's increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that's causing increased air temperatures that makes its way into the ocean, heat transfer into the ocean, then the effect of carbon dioxide will so far outstrip the sort of positive pH effects of warming water that so Joe Salisbury does a lot of these calculations, but that the reason for the warming will sort of outstrip and cover up any benefit you might get from warming water over time.
Right. Well, you also have these algal blooms occurring more frequently, and you get that biomass and same problem that we talked about earlier. So that's
So the warming water triggers more algal blooms, and then that's a driver of
more carbon dioxide again, and then those hypoxic conditions and also lower pH.
Yeah, so warming water, you can think of it again, as I was saying, our coastal zone breathes just the way we do. And warming temperatures can sort of cause it to, sort of hyperventilate. You get more respiration at higher temperatures. So, and it depends on where you are. So as we move out into the open ocean where it's a little less productive, then you get the this outstripping of carbon dioxide coming into the water, overwhelming anything that happened with warming water. And as you move inshore and you start getting a more productive system because all this stuff's coming off the land, then you start to hyperventilate. So the overall effect of warming water is probably not a positive on pH.
Mm-hmm. I think this is also points out very clearly the huge differences in coastal acidification and ocean acidification, open ocean versus coastal processes. And I think that's something that people coming into our stakeholder workshops didn't really have a very much of an understanding about. And I think it's part of that beginning education and awareness about how different it is when you get near the coast and how much more complicated and how much more dire the situation can be.
So closer to the coast is more, I'm generalizing here, is generally more acidic than out in the open ocean, or...
Well, it has more conditions coming with more factors that can create higher acidification than open ocean, because it becomes less of a buffer than what it might be out in the ocean. And I'm sure Damian can explain it better.
Well, the way I like to think of it, Scott Doney, he's a guy down at Woods Hole. The way he describes it is, long-term pH records in the open ocean. You might get variability of 0.1, 0.2, 0.3 pH units over the course of hundreds of years. You can go, you can do that much in hours in the coastal zone. So it's much more dynamic, much more variable in the coastal zone than it is in the open ocean.
Interesting. How about geographically? Say the southern part of the Gulf of Maine, kind of, let's just say Portland south versus, say, down east, closer to the Bay of Fundy.
We don't know.
Yeah. That's the answer.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's the huge gradient in development in what you just mentioned. So the coastal acidification, so that part of coastal acidification that is brought on about by the stuff coming off the land into the water, that's going to be a function of the development on the watershed. So that we know is going to sort of change. But there are cold water dynamics. What you just mentioned right now is one of the sharpest latitudinal gradients in temperature in the world. There's a huge change in temperature, as we move from where we are right now up north. So.
So, Esperanza, you've been involved in a series of stakeholder workshops. Who's been involved in those? Who's sort of paying attention to this issue, and what's been the outcome?
Well, we've just held our first in December. Prior to that, we held our State of the Science workshop, and I want to just go back just a minute to say what feeds into these workshops is the science and translating that science. And so we started, this past year, and we had all of these webinars, and we had wonderful scientists. They've been mentioned today, and they've been on our program today. And so there's been 16 of them. And so they've offered their expertise in coming together in a 2-day State of the Science workshop in sort of compiling this information and data and research results. And from that, we've brought that into our first stakeholder workshop of 5 that we're going to hold in Maine. And we really targeted and focused on recruiting to that workshop fishermen, lobstermen, clam harvesters, aquaculturists, and representatives of those, and representatives of water quality groups along the coast who are becoming even more active in looking at things like nutrients. So we wanted to bring these folks together and really have both presentations about the science, but really delve into asking them questions about, where they have seen sensitive areas, or what they've been experiencing, changes of species in the water, these kinds of things that might not have anything to do with ocean acidification, but certainly changing conditions. And then from there, we ask them, what kind of communication tools do they need to share with others, with other meetings of opportunity or whatever that they would be engaged in, and also to start putting some of this information from them into an implementation plan and then engaging them further in that plan.
And how can people become involved if they would like to do so?
Yes, we have a listserv, we have a website. It's hosted by Nericus, and I can give that website.
Yeah, why don't you go do that
now?
Yeah.
Okay. It's www.neracus.org/NECAN, NECAN.
Thank you, Esperanza. I think we have time for one quick call. Allison from Brooklyn.
Yes, hello. Thank you for a wonderful program.
Thank you.
My question is whether rockweed harvest has any interaction with ocean acidification that has been measured.
That's a great question. What do you guys think?
That is a great question, and there are there is definitely a lot of interest in that. I don't believe that we have any results from any research at this point. I know that there's also research on eelgrass, which is a very extremely important species for this topic. We do have other research going on, phenology research about the life cycle changes and timing of reproduction of rockweed. And others that are really interested in this, but I don't think there are any results from that.
Damian, any quick?
Very, very quickly, because I think Bill mentioned it as one of the recommendations from the OA panel that anytime you're growing plants in the water, you're taking CO2 out of the water, which is decreasing the CO2 in the water is helpful pH-wise. And so there has been plans to say locally plant macroalgae in different plants in the water in order to make a local refuge for better pH in those situations.
Great. Thank you. And thank you, Allison, for that great question. We'll have to address it in further detail on another show because we've come to the end of our first coastal conversation today, and our topic today was ocean acidification. I'd like to thank our guests for their time and good work. Here in the studio, we had Damian Brady from the School for Marine Sciences at the University of Maine Darling Marine Center and Director of Research at Sea Grant, and Esperanza Stancioff, who's a climate change educator with the University of Maine Cooperative Extension and Sea Grant. We also were joined earlier on the phone with Joe Salisbury, who's a professor of oceanography at the University of New Hampshire, and Bill Mook from Mook Sea Farms. Thanks to all the folks who called with your comments and questions, great questions, and thanks to everyone who listened. Coastal Conversations is produced with support from the Maine Sea Grant Program at the University of Maine, bringing marine science to Maine people. Join us from 10 to 11 a.m. on the fourth Friday of each month. On the second Friday of each month, you can still catch Talk of the Towns, a long-standing WERU public affairs program that inspired Coastal Conversations. Our show's theme music, A Following Sea, was composed and performed by Paul Anderson. Thanks to Amy Brown for engineering our program, and stay tuned for On the Wing. This is Natalie Springle, host of Coastal Conversations, wishing you a good morning.
Support for WERU comes from the Grand,